The two-story house with the blue shutters stood proudly at the end of Oak Ridge Drive. A 15-year labor of love, it was everything James and Cheryl Jackson had dreamed about when they'd first married. The front yard bloomed with flowers Cheryl had planted herself, and a large oak tree in the center cast cool shade over the porch where the family gathered on warm summer evenings. Almost done with that science project, James called out to his daughter as he carried a toolbox into the garage. Sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the fine layer of sawdust that covered his workshop. Weekends were for teaching his children the value of working with their hands, a lesson his own father had passed down to him. "Just finishing the solar system model," his daughter replied, carefully painting a tiny planet. Her twin brother sat nearby, more interested in the basketball hoop installed above the garage door than in planets and stars. Inside the house, Cheryl was going through college brochures with their oldest son. "This one has an excellent engineering program," she said, pointing to a glossy photo of a campus. "And it's only a 3-hour drive from home." "That's still close enough for Sunday dinners," she added with a smile, though her eyes held a touch of sadness at the thought of him leaving soon. As a pediatric nurse, Cheryl had worked night shifts for years to help pay for this house. James had taken on extra responsibilities as a high school principal, mentoring troubled students after hours. Their sacrifices had paid off. They now lived in one of the nicest neighborhoods in the hills of Los Angeles, even if they sometimes felt the weight of being one of the few black families in the area. "The Richardsons invited us to their barbecue next weekend," James mentioned as the family gathered for dinner that evening. The dining room table, handed down from Cheryl's grandmother, had been the center of family life for years. It had witnessed birthday celebrations, homework sessions, and countless family discussions. "Do we have to go?" their youngest asked, making a face. "Mr. Richardson always talks so loud." "It's important to be part of the community," Cheryl explained, passing a bowl of mashed potatoes. "Besides, their daughter will be there. She's in your class, isn't she?" The conversation flowed easily, from school projects to neighborhood gossip to plans for the summer. Outside, the California sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Through the dining room window, they could see the distant hills, dry from months without rain. None of them paid much attention to the news report playing quietly on the kitchen television, something about record temperatures and increased fire danger in the area. It was background noise, nothing more. Fire season came every year, after all. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, James and Cheryl sat on their back porch, looking out at the twinkling lights of Los Angeles below them. "Remember when we first saw this place?" James asked, taking his wife's hand. "You said it was too much house for us." "And you said we'd grow into it," Cheryl replied with a laugh. "You were right." The breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the garden Cheryl had planted when they first moved in. Each plant represented a year in their life here, 15 years of putting down roots, literally and figuratively. "Did you fix that sprinkler system?" Cheryl asked suddenly, remembering the fire safety brochure they'd received in the mail that week. "I'll get to it this weekend," James promised. "Don't worry, we've been through fire seasons before." Neither of them could have imagined that in less than a month, everything they'd built together would be reduced to ashes, not by an unstoppable natural disaster, but by something far more troubling. In the distance, the hills remained still and quiet, hiding the small spark that would soon grow into an inferno. And in the fire station just a few miles away, decisions were already being made about which homes would be worth saving and which would not. The summer heat pressed down on Los Angeles like a heavy blanket. 3 weeks without rain had turned the hills surrounding the city into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. James Jackson wiped sweat from his forehead as he cleared dry brush from around their property, following the guidelines from the fire department's pamphlet. "Water conservation and fire prevention don't exactly go hand in hand," he muttered to himself, looking at the pile of dead vegetation he'd collected. The governor had declared a drought emergency just last week, asking residents to cut back on watering lawns and gardens. Yet here he was, creating a defensible space that required keeping the ground around their home clear, but not completely dry. Inside, Cheryl was making a list of emergency items. "Birth certificates, insurance papers, photo albums," she said aloud, checking each box on her list. Their oldest son came into the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of water from the refrigerator. "Mom, you're being paranoid," he said with the casual confidence of youth. "The fire's never come this far into the neighborhood." "Better paranoid than unprepared," Cheryl replied, not looking up from her list. 20 years as a nurse had taught her that emergencies never announce themselves in advance. That evening, a community meeting was held at the local elementary school. The Jacksons arrived early, finding seats near the front. The room filled quickly with anxious homeowners, all seeking reassurance that their properties would be protected if the worst happened. Fire Chief Roberts stood at the podium, pointing to a large map of the area. Red zones marked high-risk neighborhoods, including the hillside where the Jacksons lived. "We've added 2 additional engines to our station this season," he explained. "Our response time should be under 7 minutes for most neighborhoods." James raised his hand. The fire chief nodded in his direction, though his smile seemed to tighten slightly. "What factors determine which homes get priority protection during an active fire?" James asked. The room grew quiet. It was the question many wanted to ask but few dared to voice. "We assess each situation based on fire behavior, access routes, and where we can save the most structures with available resources," Chief Roberts answered, his tone professional but clipped. "I assure you, demographics play no role in our decision-making." James nodded, noting how the chief had answered a question he hadn't actually asked. Beside him, Cheryl gently squeezed his hand. When question time ended, the Jacksons approached the information table to collect additional materials on fire safety. The firefighter manning the table handed them a single brochure. "Anything else we should know that's not in here?" Cheryl asked. "Just follow the evacuation orders when they come," the firefighter replied, then turned to greet the couple behind them with a much warmer, "Hey there. Got all those questions answered for you from last time." Walking to their car, James noticed that other families had received detailed maps and personalized advice about their specific streets. "Maybe we should introduce ourselves properly next time," Cheryl said quietly. "Remind them you're the principal at Roosevelt High." James shook his head. "We shouldn't need credentials to get the same information as everyone else." The next morning, James called the fire station directly. He wanted to arrange for someone to check their home's vulnerability and offer specific recommendations. The conversation was brief. "We're really swamped right now with inspections," the voice on the phone explained. "Best to follow the general guidelines in the brochure." That afternoon, James watched from his front yard as a fire department truck slowly drove through their neighborhood. It stopped at several houses, firefighters getting out to chat with homeowners. The truck passed the Jackson home without slowing. That evening, their neighbor Tom walked over with a bottle of wine. "The fire guys gave me some great tips today," he said as they sat on the porch. "They're going to prioritize our cul-de-sac if there's a fire because of the old oak trees. Said they create a natural fire break if they can wet them down in time." James nodded, not mentioning that the same oak trees extended to his property as well. Later that night, Cheryl found James in their bedroom, staring at the family photos on the wall. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "Just thinking about what we'd take if we had to leave quickly," he answered, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Something about the community meeting, the phone call, the fire truck that didn't stop. Individually, each could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that left him uneasy. "It won't come to that," Cheryl said, resting her head on his shoulder. But she didn't sound convinced. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry chaparral and sun-baked earth. In the distance, heat lightning flickered across the sky, a silent warning of what was to come. The Thursday morning sky had an unusual color, a dirty yellow that made everything look slightly off. James noticed it first as he left for work, pausing in the driveway to stare at the horizon. The air felt different too, heavy with a stillness that reminded him of the calm before a storm. "Might want to keep the windows closed today," he told Cheryl, kissing her goodbye. "Air quality doesn't look great." By noon, the yellow had deepened to orange. A small brush fire had started in the canyons 20 miles north, according to the radio reports. Nothing to worry about yet, just a routine alert. Fire season was always filled with small blazes that were quickly contained. Cheryl texted James from the hospital where she worked, "Fire on the news," keeping an eye on it. She attached a photo of the break room television showing a plume of smoke rising in the distance. The twins came home from school early. Their high school had cancelled afternoon activities due to the air quality warnings. "It smells like a campfire outside," their daughter said, dropping her backpack by the door. Her brother coughed, his asthma already responding to the change in the air. By 3 o'clock, the wind had picked up. Santa Ana winds, hot, dry gusts that swept down from the mountains, turning small fires into infernos. On the local news, a reporter stood on a ridge, her hair whipping around her face as she pointed to the growing smoke column behind her. "What began as a small brush fire has now consumed over 500 acres, she reported. Authorities are considering evacuation orders for Canyon Heights and Pine Ridge communities. Those neighborhoods were still miles away from the Jacksons' home, but closer than they'd like. Their oldest son called from college, worried after seeing the news. "Everything's fine," Cheryl assured him. "The fire's nowhere near us." But as she spoke, she moved through the house, gathering photo albums and important documents, just in case. When James called the local fire station for an update, the dispatcher sounded harried. "We're fielding a lot of calls right now, sir. Your area is still just under an advisory, not an evacuation order." "I understand that," James said patiently. "But given the wind conditions and our location, should we take precautionary measures?" "Resources are stretched thin," came the clipped response. "Just follow standard evacuation procedures if necessary." The call ended before James could ask what standard procedures meant for their specific street. By 4:30, ash began to fall like gray snow. It coated cars and rooftops, gathering in drifts against doorframes. The sky had darkened to an apocalyptic burnt orange. Even with the windows closed, the smell of smoke seeped into every corner of the house. Their neighbor Tom knocked on their door, his face tight with worry. "Just got word from my buddy at the station. They're about to issue an evacuation warning for our area. Not an order yet, but a warning." "Thanks," James said. "Any other information?" Tom hesitated. "They're setting up a defense line along River Road," said they're going to try to make a stand there. River Road ran just 2 blocks from their house. In theory, that should have been reassuring. The firefighters would be close by, ready to protect their neighborhood. But something in Tom's expression made James uneasy. Did they mention specific streets they'd be focusing on? Tom looked away. "Just that they'll do what they can with the manpower they've got. Listen, we're packing up now, heading to my sister's place in the valley. You folks might want to do the same, not wait for the official order." After Tom left, James and Cheryl called a family meeting in the kitchen. Their children watched silently as James spread a map on the table, marking evacuation routes with a red pen. "We're not in immediate danger," he said calmly. "But we're going to be ready if that changes. Each of you, pack 1 bag. Essential clothes, medications, anything you absolutely can't leave behind that fits in a backpack." Their daughter looked at the wall of family photos in the hallway. "What about all of our pictures?" "I've got the albums," Cheryl said, pointing to a plastic bin by the door. "And most of the recent ones are backed up online." James's phone buzzed with an emergency alert. "Evacuation warning for Hillcrest, Oak Ridge, and Westview areas. Be prepared to evacuate. Monitor local news for updates." From the backyard, they could now see a faint orange glow reflecting off the clouds of smoke. The fire had crested the first ridge of hills. Between those hills and their neighborhood lay nothing but dry chaparral and scattered homes. "I'm going to drive up to the lookout point," James decided. "See how close it really is." "Not alone," Cheryl insisted, grabbing her jacket. They left the twins with strict instructions: start loading the car and be ready to leave at a moment's notice. As James backed out of the driveway, he noticed several of their neighbors doing the same. A small convoy of cars filled with hastily packed possessions, pets and carriers, faces tight with worry. At the end of their street, they spotted something that made them pause. A fire truck, stationed at the neighborhood entrance. For the first time that day, James felt a flicker of relief. Help was already here. But that relief would be short-lived. James pulled their car to the curb beside the fire truck. 3 firefighters stood nearby, pointing at a map spread across the hood. Their faces were already smudged with soot, their expressions grim but focused. The tallest one, with captain's bars on his helmet, noticed the Jacksons and nodded briefly before returning to the map. "Excuse me," James said, approaching with Cheryl at his side. "We live on Oak Ridge Drive. Is there anything we should know that hasn't been announced yet? The captain glanced up. Official evacuation warning's been issued. Order might come in the next hour if the wind doesn't change. Best get your essentials packed. We've done that, Cheryl said. But we're wondering about defense plans. Our neighbor mentioned River Road being a line of defense. The captain straightened up, studying them for a moment. We're positioning units based on fire behavior and resource availability. Can't give specifics yet. As he spoke, another car pulled up. The Wilsons from 3 doors down. The captain immediately walked over to greet them, his posture relaxing into something more conversational. Dave, good timing. We were just discussing your street, he said, loud enough for the Jacksons to hear. He put an arm around Mr. Wilson's shoulder, guiding him to the map. See this approach? We're setting up sprinklers on these roofs here, yours included. James and Cheryl exchanged glances. Their home was on the same street as the Wilsons. Sir, James said, stepping closer. We're on that street too. Will the sprinkler system extend to our property? The captain looked up, his expression cooling. As I said, we're making tactical decisions based on available resources. Not every home can get individual attention. I understand that, James persisted, keeping his voice level. But our house is literally next to the properties you're discussing protecting. It would seem logical to include it in the same defensive strategy. One of the younger firefighters looked uncomfortable, glancing between James and the captain. The third firefighter had busied himself with equipment, pointedly not participating in the conversation. Look, the captain said, his voice dropping, we can't be everywhere at once. We're setting up where we believe we'll be most effective. I suggest you follow the evacuation warning and get your family to safety. Mr. Wilson was looking at them now, a flicker of awkward recognition crossing his face. These are our neighbors, Dan, he said to the captain. Good people, known them for years. The captain nodded curtly. Then you'll understand we're doing everything we can with what we've got. Cheryl stepped forward. What my husband is asking is whether our home is being included in your defensive planning. It's a simple yes or no question. The radio on the captain's belt crackled with static, then a voice calling for an update. The captain reached for it, seemingly relieved by the interruption. Got to take this. Wilson will be by your place in 30 to set up those lines. As the captain stepped away, the younger firefighter approached them. Ma'am, sir, he said quietly. I'd pack your valuables now. Take what you can't replace. The wind's pushing this fire faster than anyone expected. His kindness only deepened their concern. James thanked him, then led Cheryl back to their car. They're not going to help us, are they? She asked once they were inside. James gripped the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the darkening sky. Not if they can avoid it. On the drive back to their house, they passed 3 more fire trucks heading into the neighborhood. One stopped at the Richardsons' house, firefighters already unrolling hoses. Another was setting up at the cul-de-sac where the neighborhood association president lived. Back home, the twins had filled the car with their emergency bags. Their daughter was wrapping her grandmother's china in newspaper, carefully placing each piece in a plastic bin. Their son was hosing down the roof. A futile gesture against what was coming, but it gave him something to do. James went to the garage and pulled out 2 more garden hoses. Help me set these up, he told his son. They worked quickly, connecting the hoses to outdoor faucets, positioning them near the most vulnerable parts of the house. Inside, Cheryl was on the phone with their insurance company. Yes, I understand you're getting a lot of calls, she said, her voice tight with controlled frustration. I just need to confirm our coverage in case of total loss. Their daughter sat at the dining room table, methodically taking photos of each room with her phone. For the insurance, she explained when James looked at her questioningly. So, we can prove what we had. James nodded, his chest aching with a complicated mix of pride and sorrow. His children shouldn't have to think about such things. His phone rang, their oldest son calling again from college. Dad, I'm seeing the fire on the news. They're showing our neighborhood. We're fine, James assured him, stepping onto the back porch where he could see the ridge. The glow was brighter now and closer. Just taking precautions. The fire department is here. He didn't mention what had happened with the captain. No need to worry his son more than necessary. I can drive home, his son offered. I could be there in 3 hours. Absolutely not, James said firmly. The roads will be chaos. We'll come to you if we need to evacuate. After hanging up, James made one last attempt, calling the fire station directly. This is James Jackson on Oak Ridge Drive, he began when someone finally answered. I've just spoken with firefighters in our neighborhood who appear to be protecting some homes but not others. I'm trying to understand if there's a plan for our street. The dispatcher's response was practiced, detached. Sir, all deployment decisions are made based on strategic considerations and resource availability. I can't comment on specific tactical decisions. Can you at least tell me if anyone will be coming to our property? James pressed. A pause. I don't have that information, sir. Please follow all evacuation orders when issued. As he hung up, James noticed something through the window, another fire truck turning onto their street. For a moment, hope flared. Then the truck slowed, not at their house, but at the one across the street. James. Cheryl called from inside. The alert just changed to a mandatory evacuation order. He watched as firefighters quickly unrolled hoses at their neighbor's house. No one even glanced in their direction. The decision was clear. They were on their own. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches almost to breaking point. Ash swirled in miniature tornadoes across the yard as James stood on his driveway, watching firefighters set up equipment at the house directly across the street. The sky had turned an unnatural shade of orange-red, like something from another planet. Sir, you need to evacuate now. A police officer called from a patrol car that slowly drove down the street. This area is under mandatory evacuation. James waved to show he heard, but he couldn't make himself move yet. The contrast was too stark, too obvious. Firefighters working frantically to save the homes of some neighbors while completely ignoring others. Their house, the Patels 2 doors down, the Gonzalezes at the corner, all left undefended. James, we need to go, Cheryl said from behind him, car keys in hand. The twins stood by the loaded car, their faces masks of anxiety and confusion. Just give me a minute, James replied, his voice tight. Then, decision made, he strode across the street toward the fire captain. The man was directing his crew, pointing to the roof of their neighbor's house where another firefighter was already setting up a sprinkler system. Excuse me, James said, his tone polite but firm. I'm from across the street. Is there a reason my home isn't receiving any protection measures? The captain turned, recognition flashing across his face. Sir, I've already explained our resource limitations. We can't cover every structure. James gestured at the street. I understand that. What I don't understand is why every house being protected seems to belong to a white family, while those being left defenseless belong to minorities. The captain's face hardened. That's a serious accusation. We're making tactical decisions based on where we can be most effective. Based on what criteria? James pressed, aware that Cheryl had now joined him, standing silently at his side. My home is identical in construction to this one. It faces the same direction. It has the same vulnerability to the approaching fire. The only difference is who lives in it. A small crowd had gathered now, other neighbors who hadn't yet evacuated, a few firefighters pausing in their work to listen. The captain looked around, clearly uncomfortable with the audience. Look, he said, lowering his voice. The incident commander has assigned us specific structures to defend. I don't make those calls. I just follow orders. And those orders just happen to exclude the homes of every Black, Asian, and Latino family on this street. Cheryl asked, her normally gentle voice sharp with disbelief. One of the younger firefighters nearby shifted uncomfortably, looking away. Another muttered something to his colleague. James couldn't hear the words, but the dismissive laughter that followed made his stomach clench. You folks need to evacuate, the captain said firmly. We've got work to do here, and you're interfering with emergency operations. He turned his back on them, a clear dismissal. James felt something snap inside him, not anger exactly, but the final breaking of his faith in a system he'd always trusted despite its flaws. As a school principal, he'd spent his career working within institutions, believing they could be improved from the inside. Now, watching his home being written off as expendable, that belief crumbled. I want your name and badge number, James said, pulling out his phone. And I want to speak to your supervisor. The captain turned back, his face flushed. "Are you filming me? That's interfering with emergency operations." "I'm documenting a discriminatory response to a public emergency," James replied, holding his ground. "Unless you can provide a concrete, logical reason why identical homes on the same street are receiving dramatically different protection based on who lives in them." Several neighbors had their phones out now too. The captain looked around, suddenly aware that this confrontation was being recorded from multiple angles. "Richardson," he barked at a nearby firefighter. "Take a line to the property across the street, baseline protection only." The firefighter nodded, grabbing a single hose. It was a token gesture, nothing like the comprehensive defense being set up for other homes, but it was something. "Happy now?" the captain asked, his voice cold. "No," James answered honestly, "but it's a start." The whoop of sirens cut through the air as another fire truck turned onto their street. The battalion chief stepped out, quickly taking in the tense scene. "Captain Rogers, what's the situation here?" he asked. "Just a resource allocation dispute, Chief," the captain replied. "I've addressed it." The chief looked at James and Cheryl, then at the neighbors with their phones still recording. "Is that accurate?" he asked James directly. Before James could answer, one of the younger firefighters stepped forward. "Sir, I believe there's an equity issue with our deployment. Some homes are receiving full protection measures while others are getting minimal or no defense, and there seems to be a pattern to which is which." The captain's face darkened with anger at the insubordination, but the chief raised a hand to silence him. "Show me," he said to the young firefighter. As they walked away to discuss it, Cheryl tugged at James's arm. "We need to go," she insisted. "The fire's getting closer, and the kids are terrified." James looked back at their home, the blue shutters, the oak tree in the yard, 15 years of their lives contained within those walls. The firefighter was stringing out a single hose line toward their property, a gesture so inadequate it was almost worse than nothing at all. "Take photos of everything," he told Cheryl, his voice breaking slightly. "Document what they're doing at each house." As they walked back to their car, the ground trembled beneath their feet, not an earthquake, but the approaching fire creating its own weather system, its heat and power so intense it affected the atmosphere around it. Their son leaned out the car window. "Dad, we need to leave now." James looked back one last time at the firefighters working frantically to save certain homes while barely pretending to protect others. The captain caught his eye briefly, then looked away. Some things, once seen, could never be unseen. And some fires, James realized, had been burning long before today. 3 days felt like 3 years. The Jacksons stayed with Cheryl's sister in a small apartment 30 miles away, 5 people crammed into a 2-bedroom space that would have felt claustrophobic under normal circumstances. Now it was a lifeline, a roof, walls, safety. The twins slept on an air mattress in the living room, whispering late into the night when they thought no one could hear them. Their whispers always circled back to the same question: would there be anything left? News reports showed the fire's devastation in dramatic aerial footage, entire blocks reduced to ash, others mysteriously spared. Reporters stood in front of untouched homes, telling stories of miracle saves and heroic stands by firefighters. Nobody mentioned the pattern that was becoming clear to anyone looking closely enough. On the 3rd day, officials finally lifted evacuation orders for their neighborhood. Residents may return to assess damage, the alert read, as if there might be something to salvage. The drive back felt surreal. Main roads were clear, but side streets were littered with debris, fallen trees, burned cars abandoned during evacuation, melted trash cans. Police checkpoints verified addresses before allowing residents to proceed. At one point, they drove past a news crew interviewing a family standing in front of their intact home, the mother tearfully thanking firefighters for saving everything they owned. "Maybe it's not as bad as we think," their daughter said from the backseat, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in days. James didn't answer. He'd seen the satellite images online, had studied them until his eyes burned. He knew what was waiting. Their street was barely recognizable. The familiar landmarks, the oak trees, the decorative lampposts, the wooden fence along the Richardsons' property were gone. In their place was a bizarre patchwork. Some homes standing completely intact next to others reduced to concrete foundations and twisted metal. Cheryl gripped James's hand so tightly her nails left marks. "Oh God," she whispered. Where their blue-shuttered house had once stood was nothing but ash and blackened debris. The chimney remained, a lone sentinel standing guard over nothing. The oak tree in the yard was a charred skeleton, its branches reaching toward the sky like desperate fingers. James pulled into what had been their driveway, now just a strip of concrete leading to devastation. Nobody spoke as they got out of the car. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of ash under their feet and the distant sound of a generator from somewhere down the street. Their son walked toward where his bedroom had been, kicking at a piece of melted plastic, his basketball trophy, maybe, or part of his gaming console. Impossible to tell now. Their daughter stood frozen, staring at the destruction. "Everything's gone," she said, her voice small and lost. "All our pictures, my books, everything." Cheryl moved through the ruins methodically, as if conducting an inventory. She paused over a blackened lump that might have been her grandmother's china cabinet, carefully brushing ash away to reveal a single unbroken teacup, somehow preserved amid the destruction. James walked to where their back porch had been. From this spot, he could see the pattern clearly. The houses still standing formed a distinct line down the middle of the street. On one side, homes were largely intact, with minor damage to yards and outbuildings. On their side, where the Patels, the Gonzaleses, and the Wongs had lived, there was nothing but destruction. A fire truck rolled slowly down the street. Different crew, different captain, but the same department. The firefighters didn't make eye contact with any of the families picking through the ruins. "Dad." Their son appeared at his side, holding up his phone. "Look at this." It was a message from their neighbor across the street, whose home stood perfectly intact. Attached was a photo taken during the height of the fire, a clear shot of firefighters standing in formation, hoses directed at the intact homes, their backs literally turned to the houses now reduced to ash. "I thought you should see this," the message read. They didn't even try. James felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Not surprise. He'd known this was coming, but confirmation. Evidence. A car pulled up beside their ruined home. Mr. Patel from 2 doors down stepped out, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Your house too," he said, not a question but a shared understanding. "All 3 of us on this side, all gone." They were interrupted by a fire department SUV that parked at the curb. A man in a crisp uniform approached, clipboard in hand. "I'm Battalion Chief Ramirez," he said. "I'm documenting fire damage for the official report. Mind if I ask you some questions? Like why certain homes were protected while others weren't?" Cheryl asked, her voice sharper than James had ever heard it. The chief's expression didn't change. "The report will detail all tactical decisions made during the incident," he said, his tone neutral. "I understand your frustration, but I can assure you that our department followed standard protocols based on fire behavior, wind patterns, and resource availability. And those protocols just happened to save every white-owned home while letting every minority-owned home burn," James asked quietly. The chief glanced around, noting neighbors gathering listening. "The investigation will be thorough," he said. "If you have specific concerns, there's a process for filing them." "Oh, we will," James assured him. "Along with these." He held up his phone, showing the photo their neighbor had sent, the firefighters with their backs to the homes now destroyed. The chief's professional mask slipped for just a moment. "Where did you get that?" "Does it matter?" James asked. "What matters is what it shows." As the chief departed, promising to look into the matter, the Jacksons stood together in the ruins of 15 years of memories. The twins leaned against each other, shoulders touching in silent support. Cheryl carefully wrapped the lone surviving teacup in a handkerchief, tucking it into her pocket. "What do we do now?" their daughter asked. James looked at the devastation around them, then at the intact homes across the street. The pattern was too obvious, too deliberate to ignore. This wasn't just about losing their house. It was about a system that had decided some families deserved protection while others didn't. "Now," he said, "we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The morning sun cast long shadows over the charred remains of what used to be the Jackson family home. Cheryl stood at the edge of their property, her eyes fixed on the blackened foundation. The smell of ash still hung in the air weeks after the fire had passed through. "We need to talk about what happened," James said quietly, joining his wife. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. not just for us. Their temporary apartment felt nothing like home. The walls were too thin, the furniture unfamiliar. Their children tried to make the best of it, but everyone felt the weight of what they'd lost. It wasn't just the house, it was 15 years of memories, of birthday celebrations and holiday gatherings, of first steps and school projects proudly displayed on walls that no longer existed. The local news painted a story of heroic firefighters who had saved the neighborhood. Miracle on Hillside Drive, one headline read, describing how only a handful of homes had been lost while dozens were saved. The reporter stood in front of pristine houses, interviewing smiling homeowners who praised the fire department's quick response. Cheryl couldn't stomach it anymore. After a sleepless night, she picked up her phone and dialed the number of a journalist who had once interviewed her about the hospital where she worked. "There's another side to this story," she said when the journalist answered, "and nobody's telling it." 2 days later, they sat in a coffee shop, Cheryl sliding a folder across the table. Inside were the photos their neighbor had taken during the fire, images showing firefighters actively protecting certain homes while ignoring others. There were timestamps, locations, everything that told the story the official reports have left out. "I'm not looking for sympathy," Cheryl explained. "I want accountability." The journalist nodded slowly. "I'll need to talk to other families too. Was yours the only minority-owned home that burned?" It wasn't. Within a week, the journalist had connected with 2 other families, the Wongs and the Rodriguezes, whose homes had also been destroyed while their neighbors' properties remained intact. "They told me they were making tactical decisions," Mr. Rodriguez recalled, his voice tight with anger. "But the tactics seemed pretty clear to us." The investigation took weeks. The journalist interviewed former firefighters, experts in emergency response, and community members. Some spoke openly. Others would only talk off the record, afraid of retaliation. When the story finally ran, it wasn't just a small piece, it was a front-page exposé with the headline, "Pattern of Prejudice: How Fire Protection Decisions Left Minority Homes in Ashes." The fire department issued immediate denials. The mayor promised a thorough investigation. Some community members rallied around the firefighters, insisting that any suggestion of bias was unfounded. But the evidence was hard to dismiss. More photos emerged from other residents. Department records showed response patterns that couldn't easily be explained by wind direction or resource limitations. For the Jacksons, the fight for justice became a new purpose. James spoke at community meetings, his voice steady and determined. "This isn't about one fire or one family," he would say. "It's about making sure every home, every life, is valued equally when disaster strikes." Their children watched and learned. Their oldest son delayed college for a year to help with the advocacy work. The twins started a student group at their new school focused on community equality. The official investigation took months, but its findings were unambiguous. The report documented concerning patterns in resource allocation and recommended sweeping changes in emergency response protocols, including bias training and community oversight. As spring arrived, the Jacksons broke ground on their new home. The foundation was laid on the same spot where their old house had stood. This time, neighbors from across the community came to help, a gesture of solidarity and healing. "We're not just rebuilding a house," Cheryl told a new reporter who came to cover the story. "We're helping rebuild trust, and that's harder, but even more necessary." As she mixed cement alongside neighbors she barely knew 6 months earlier, Cheryl realized that from the ashes of discrimination had risen something unexpected, a community finally having the difficult conversations it had avoided for generations. The new house would be different from the old one. And maybe, just maybe, the community would be different too.